Welcome to the Newsworthy. All the day's news in less than 10 minutes. Fast, fair, fun, and on the go. Today, the last word from a missing journalist, and Apple's new privacy rules, plus goodbye Big Bird and hello jackpots. Those stories and many more in less than 10 minutes. Then hang out after the news for Thing to Know Thursday. Today's bonus interview is all about China's new social credit system, where even jaywalking can hurt your score. I'm Erica Mandy. Today is Thursday, October 18th. You ready? Let's do this. President Trump said he expects a full report today from U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about the missing Saudi journalist. Pompeo went to Saudi Arabia and Turkey this week to meet with both leaders about the situation, all while new details are coming out. Remember, Jamal Khashoggi wrote for The Washington Post and was living in the U.S., but he disappeared after going to the Saudi consulate in Turkey earlier this month. He's been critical of the Saudi regime. Now the New York Times cites sources who say there are audio tapes proving he was murdered there. Turkey says Saudi Arabia is in fact responsible, but Saudi Arabia still says it wasn't us. President Trump's latest response is that the U.S. will look into the audio tape, quote, if it exists, that he needs to hear it to believe it. Fox News reports the president is warning against a rush to judgment, even as some senators from both parties call for consequences against Saudi Arabia. The president is saying, yes, let's figure out what happened, but he's also taking a much softer stance than others, saying it's important to protect security and business ties with Saudi Arabia. And one more thing. The Washington Post just published what is most likely Jamal Khashoggi's last column, an article his assistant handed over just one day after he disappeared. And the column is all about the need for freedom of the press in the Middle East. The governments in the U.S. and Mexico are paying close attention. The AP reports a new caravan of Central American migrants are hoping to reach the U.S. border. An estimated 4,000 people now are working their way toward the U.S. Many started in Honduras, where they're hoping to get away from poverty and violence. President Trump told governments in Central American countries that they need to stop this crowd before they reach the U.S., or else those countries could have U.S. funding cut off. He also tweeted it's a great issue for Republicans right before midterm elections just weeks away. Mexico has said it's sending federal police officers to intervene. A new report says spammers pretending to be a digital marketing firm and hoping to make money were behind Facebook's biggest security breach ever. The Wall Street Journal cites sources who say so far Facebook does not think it was foreign agents. Remember, Facebook forced a logout for millions of users last month. The company realized hackers were able to get a hold of account access keys and data. On the record, though, Facebook is not saying much about this, just that the FBI is now involved. But that does not necessarily mean foreign governments are not trying to gain influence online. In fact, Twitter just released more than 10 million tweets from thousands of accounts that are linked to Russia and Iran, showing how the governments there are in fact using social media for political power. ABC News reports it's the first time the public and researchers have been given access to this kind of data, what one analyst called the motherlode of information. Curious what data Apple has on you? Well, now you can find out and request to see it all. While other tech companies deal with data hacks and controversies, Apple is trying to stand out for not keeping as much info about you. CNBC reports Apple announced several new privacy updates, including a new privacy website that allows you to find all the data the company has on you. And coming in the future, more encryption to help keep things more private and secure. There are several more stories for you, but I want to take a quick break to thank our sponsor this week, Swap.com, the world's largest online consignment and thrift store. Everything you find on the site is gently used, quality, hand-inspected items, and there are new items added daily. In fact, Swap.com just added a whole new category, shoes. So you can find everything from shoes to kids' Halloween costumes to women's workout clothes. It also sells brands like Lululemon, Carter's, Nike, J.Crew, and Gap, letting you save up to 90% off retail price. It's easy to search for what you want with their filters. Plus, once you buy, if something doesn't fit, there are hassle-free returns within 30 days. Swap.com is offering a special offer to the Newsworthy listeners. You can get 35% off select items for your first order with the promo code Newsworthy, that's all one word, Newsworthy, or just check out Swap.com's homepage to see new deals listed every day. Now, back to the news. Did fans really interfere? That was the big question at Game 4 of the American League Championship Series last night. A player for the Houston Astros hit what possibly could have been a 2-run home run. But when the Boston Red Sox right fielder jumped up to make the catch, fans reached over too, and the umpire ultimately ruled it was fan interference. The Boston Red Sox went on to win 8-6. Cue the controversy about that call. And now, if the Boston Red Sox win tonight, they head to the World Series. As for the National League, the LA Dodgers need just one more win on Friday to make it to the World Series. Stay tuned. It was the world's first hit reality show and sort of a social experiment. Remember MTV's The Real World? Well, it's getting a reboot and going online with Facebook Watch in what Deadline calls a landmark deal with MTV Studios. Here's the twist. Vulture reports it'll now be interactive. Fans will vote on who will join the house as the final cast member. It's set to debut next year. It's the end of an era for Sesame Street. The voice behind Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch, yes, it was the same person, is retiring after nearly 50 years on the job. Variety reports he started with Sesame Street's premiere back in 1969. Today will be puppeteer Carol Spinney's last day on the iconic children's show, although his voice recordings will still be used some next year. He said in a statement that Big Bird helped him find his purpose. The Mega Millions and the Powerball jackpots just got bigger. There were no winning tickets sold for either drawing this week, so now you have another chance for both. The Mega Millions jackpot is now nearly $900 million, the second largest payout of any lottery in U.S. history. The next drawing is now on Friday. And the new Powerball jackpot is $430 million. The next drawing for that is Saturday. But remember, there's no winner so far for a reason, because the odds are not good. And that's it for the main news today, but it's now time for Thing to Know Thursday, where a different expert explains a different thing to know every Thursday after the news. This week, we are talking about the possible pros and cons of China's new social credit system. Think a credit score in the U.S., but on a whole new level, based not just on financials, but on behavior. And yes, the government is using tech like facial recognition to track citizens. Here to talk about this is Rachel Botsman. She's an acclaimed author and lecturer at Oxford University. She writes and researches about technology and trust and what it all means for our lives. Her TED Talks have been viewed more than 4 million times, and her newest book is called Who Can You Trust? So here's my conversation with Rachel Botsman. Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for coming on The Newsworthy.
It's good to be here.
So I first want to make sure listeners understand what is China's new social credit system, at least on a basic level, and why does this exist in the first place?
So the social credit system, or what is also known as citizen scores or trust scores, was started by the Chinese government around 4 years ago now, in 2014. And it's basically a system by, instead of having like we would have a traditional credit score, by 2020 it will become mandatory for every Chinese person to have this trust score. And they will be assessed in all different areas of their lives. So things that you might expect, like whether you pay your bills on time, whether you pay your taxes, but also things that you might not expect, like what kind of goods you buy online, whether you jaywalk. All these things will input into a score. This is the thing that we have to get our heads around, that this isn't a nice to have. This isn't like joining some kind of rewards club. This is going to be a mandatory system that follows people around for life.
I mean, we have a credit score right here in the U.S. This sounds like a whole other level. I mean, you mentioned jaywalking.
Yeah, it does take it to another level. I think what's really important, and I always remind myself of this as well, is we can't just look at this through a Western lens. So the thing that we have to remember is that many people in China, millions of people in China, that don't have traditional credit scores. So if you look at the policy documents, one of the reasons why the Chinese government say that they've introduced this kind of score is to create a more trustworthy society and to allow people who don't have a traditional credit score to take out things like loans and insurance. Well, that sounds all well and good, but there's a very dark line around this as to where is this really about the benefit of society and the economy, and where is this really about surveillance and an invasion of privacy, because, they're voice sampling people when they go to the doctor. As I mentioned, if you jaywalk, your score might appear in real time on a billboard, and you can see your score going down. People are blacklisted for all kinds of things. And the part that really frightens me is that the consequence doesn't always align with the cause. So, your children can be banned from going from certain schools. You can be prohibited from taking certain jobs. They've just banned more than 6 million Chinese people from going on high-speed trains and planes. There's a whole list of punishments that doesn't just affect your life, it affects your family's life as well. One of the things that worries me, not just about what's happening in China, but Western society, is when the world, and particularly children, are reduced to numbers, to rating and review systems, because what kind of culture does that create? Where's the room for transgressions? Where's the room for forgiveness and really just being human?
How are they tracking millions of people's behavior? And some of this tech that I understand that they're using is tech that we're using here in Western society as well, right?
That's exactly right. And that's why I think we shouldn't point the finger at China and assume that we're that far from this kind of system. And, it's interesting as you speak to people in China, and there's very mixed views on this as to whether it's a good or bad thing, because they will say that they've been under a system of surveillance for a very long time, and at least this is somewhat transparent. The way they're tracking people, one of the things that gets a bit confused is many of the big data companies like Alibaba, they will have their own scores. So they have a separate system called Sesame credit scores. But what we really don't know, because it's just one big black box, is how the data on all Alibaba's platforms feeds into the government. They've admitted that, and it's not surprising because it's China, but they'll get into online monitoring. So journalists have actually been hit quite hard with this scoring mechanism, because if you say something that is against the government or something they don't like, that can affect your score. But if we were connected and say you said something about Tiananmen Square, my score might also go down. I worry about a black market, for being able to game your score, because we've seen how that exists in social networks. I think there'll be a whole industry and sort of reputational advisors actually advising you how you can increase your score. But I also really worry about the impact this will have on social relationships and friendships, particularly in younger people, where there's an incentive to try and friend people with higher scores and unfriend people with lower scores. And I think that's where people go with the series Black Mirror, where there's the episode Nosedive, where she's trying to up her score to get an apartment. And so she's going back and thinking about all the high influences in her life. One of the things that really drives me in my work is how we change this relationship with technology, so it's not creating this constant culture of feeling judged and evaluated and this pressure from peers that we've never lived with before.
You mentioned the episode in Black Mirror, and basically everyone can see each other's scores. As you mentioned, they base their whole lives around it and who they should be friends with. What do you think of that comparison? Do you think that is an accurate comparison?
I think that episode, I think the whole series is genius. I mean, I think that's around the corner if we're clumsy with technology. And with the way the companies and the way we're behaving right now, I don't think it's so far off. It's quite extreme. But I think what the episode does so well is the feeling of the main character, Lacey, not entirely understanding how her score works. And then there's that amazing scene where she shows up at the airport and she can't get on a plane because she doesn't realize that when she was rude to someone earlier in the day, that impacted her score. And I think the other scene I really remember in Nosedive is when she meets the trucker whose husband was denied cancer treatment because there was someone with a higher score in the hospital. And she basically had decided she was going to check out of this society and this system because it wasn't something she wanted to live with. And so I think that's going to become really interesting, is those that choose to live their lives on social media and in China under these very extreme systems, and what happens to people if they don't want to play.
Are there any other final thoughts about the consequences and the ultimate impact of a system like this?
You have to look at this with quite, a clear and balanced view and ask yourself, could it help people? Is the question I'm always like, is there a side to this I am not seeing? So, for example, good people who look bad by traditional financial assessment, could they actually prove they are good citizens and find a way into the formal financial systems through these scoring mechanisms? So I think that's really important. The bigger question for me, though, is, what is going on right now, particularly in the US, around assessing the way we behave and maybe our political intentions or all kinds of motivations. So I think it's really easy to point the finger at China, but we should look at China and go, do we want that kind of society? Do we want to live in that kind of society here? And if we don't, what do we really need to be changing around our behaviors to prevent that from happening?
And of course, you can find links to Rachel Botsman's book or more articles about China's social credit system in today's show notes. Just go to thenewsworthy.com, click episodes, and find today's date. That's also where you'll find sources and story links to all the news we talked about in this episode. And if you find today's topic interesting, please be sure to share it. Thank you so much for listening today. And remember, The Newsworthy is here for you at 4 a.m. every weekday. So we'll chat again tomorrow. Have a great day.